Thanks for tuning in today. We are going to talk about empowered questions that lead to empowered solutions with your marriage. My takeaway from this was when you see something positive or a trait or a situation that someone is in, you need to start formulating questions to ask how did they get to that goal or how do they achieve that situation? And that will kind of help formulate you and how you can get to there as well.
Yeah, we talk about having and shifting from the victim mentality to a winner's mentality. And that is by asking empowered questions, right? We give a specific example on how to set a goal and work your way back in order to figure out where do I need to start and the process of asking the questions that will get you moving forward in an actionable way. So, yeah, man, I wanted to talk to you today about this idea I've been toying with, right? And it comes from my sales background. It comes from being a business owner, and it comes from just self improvement, right? And I felt that a lot of those things can often relate to marriage and how we move and communicate within our marriages. So I'll just start off by asking you this question, right? Do you and your wife practice I'll call it an art of asking empowered questions?
That's a good question. Um, but I guess before I can answer that, what do you mean by like empowered questions?
Yeah. So I guess the entire idea is to ask those types of questions to give yourselves empowered answers or solutions, right? And I think a lot about it when I think about moving towards a goal, right? So if you're asking empowered questions, you're avoiding the victim mentality, right? So it's less of, why is this happening to us? And it's, owning your part in whatever your situation is, and then asking a question more like, how can we accomplish the goal that we want? How can we move forward? What can we do? What can we control in order to get where we're going?
No, that makes perfect sense. I think ultimately, my wife and I, not always initially, but maybe when we're in a situation, we're like, wait a minute, because we are people of faith. So we're like, okay, what's the lesson here? God, what are you trying to teach us? And then so I think it might be a version of that. So when we start reaching back, okay, so what did we do? What are we supposed to do? How can we get better? Is there something that we're weak in that we need to strengthen as we're going through this, whatever the situation is? And that's kind of we kind of recalibrate if we don't catch it early enough. But I think generally we start the lens on that more so in something that is or could be seen as trying, maybe something that's uncomfortable or a trial or something that we're like, why are we doing like that? You would generally be like, why are we having to deal with this? It's more like, okay, what's the lesson? All right, this is hard, but we're going to learn something from this. And so then we start checking off the evaluation process. I think that's more of a way we attack it than more um unless that is, you can let me know if that's kind of your idea of what that is.
I mean, I think it could be different for everybody, right? It's not, you know, uh, a set formula, I guess. However it works for you, it works for you. But I think that it's just beneficial to try to eliminate the victim mindset. And I don't think typically people who sit in that arena necessarily know that's what they're doing, unless
Right.
it's point, right? Um, I've I've noticed it within my family growing up, right? It's kind of like, well, I think this should happen, and this should be given to me, and I shouldn't have to do this. And I'm like, come on, you know that's not reality.
Right.
Now, I'm all for handouts, right? And I understand that there are people who need them. I've had the occasional handout myself, right? But I also understand that it takes effort to be who you want to be, and have the things you want to have, go the places you want to go, earn the type of money you want to earn. And I feel like inherently most people know that. But what I guess I'm also saying is there are a lot of people who don't want to feel the pain, right? Oh, all right. So case in point, I saw this video yesterday actually, and within the audio, the woman said the there's a direct correlation between you having the things you want to have, or how should you say it, being the person you want to be. And the correlation is directly linked to your willingness to experience the opposite. Okay. So
Yeah.
she went on to explain that, let's say, you're in school, and the process of learning makes you feel stupid, but that process of learning is making you smart.
Right.
Right. So if we're trying to bring this back to marriage, and we are wanting to save for a house,
Hmm.
saving is making you feel broke.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So if we tie it back to empowered questions, it's like, all right, we start in an area, and we figure out what our goals are, right? Which is kind of a different episode, right? But
Hmm.
um how do we get to that goal? Well, in any business training, any sales training, they'll tell you to walk it back, deconstruct what your goal is, get back down to step one, right? So you work your way from the end to the beginning. So then you now understand how to walk your way forward,
Right.
right? And then once you get down to the nitty gritty, the beginning of it, you start asking empowered questions. Okay, from this point, how do we move forward? Which will then give you an empowered solution, right? I've talked a lot, man.
Yeah. No, I think it's ideally to make it less intimidating, it's more being intentional and being thoughtful with a purpose when you're starting to ask questions around your marriage. And I see it as kind of data gathering, right? Like if you have a goal in mind, you have to kind of step back and look at all the scenarios, and maybe that's just how my brain works. Some people are process on the fly people, and that's not always where I am. So I see it as kind of data gathering. Where do we want to go? How can we get there? And then start asking questions to get to that place.
Mhm.
Is that maybe that could be one version of empowered questions?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so I guess my question is, I'll give it back to what you asked me. Do you practice it? And if so, how do you practice it within your marriage?
Yeah. So I would have to say that I'm more of the leader in this area. Um, I don't think my wife typically thinks this way, right? I want to say that she is more problem oriented, where I tend to be more solution oriented, right? Now, this is something that we've been working on because this is something that we're trying to teach our children,
Hmm.
right? And I, like I said, I've kind of led the charge in this area. Um, so I think maybe that is the way that we've been practicing it. But then even when we come upon our own struggles, I feel like my wife may tend sometimes to, I think maybe it's more or less because she knows I'm this way that she kind of leans into me to start throwing solutionary ideas out there. I don't know if I'm making up word solutionary, but hey, write it down.
Right, right.
Right. Um, but then once we get in that mind, in that place, we're both thinking that way. And that might be the case for a lot of marriages, right? Unless, the two partners are, alike in that manner. But I know for us, it leans to me first, and then once I kind of bring the conversation around to, well, let's think about what we can do, what we can control. We both start thinking on that same pattern.
That makes sense. Um, so what what would be a good example to help people kind of understand that process, or maybe not a specific example, or like a area that you could use this in? I know we talked about a little bit, you talked about buying a house, and we talked about in the prep, talking about like maybe steps for
Well,
the future or something of that nature.
let's stick on buying a house, right? Um, all right. So you've sat down with your spouse, and that's become your ultimate goal, or your next grand goal, right? Buying a house. But let's say maybe you're only making a combined 45 grand, right? And you have no savings at this point. So you're looking at the situation and you're thinking, that's impossible. There's no way that we're going to be able to buy a house, the house that we want, with the money that we have coming in, right? If you put
Hmm.
it in our scenario, we have 3 kids, right? You in that scenario, you're probably making too much money for any sort of financial aid, but not enough money to make your dream come true quickly.
Right.
So if you start thinking that way and you get stuck in that, you might just end up thinking to yourself, you know what, it's just not going to be. We'll just be renters, and it is what it is, right? It's I'll be content, in air quotes, right? Just having what we have. Well, that doesn't need to be the case. So let's, we start working it backwards. We want to buy a house. We need how much money to buy that house? Let's call it, $250,000, right? So we write that down. Well, how do we get to $250,000? Well, how long do you want it to take to get to the house? How long are you willing to be in this project, right? Um, let's call it 10 years. All right. So then divide that out. You need to be able to then set aside $25,000 a year, right? And at $25,000 a year, $45,000 ain't getting you there. So how do we increase the amount of money that we have coming in order to make that goal of 10 years? Well, maybe we need to start working on the side. Maybe we need to start looking at gaining some other knowledge in order to move into a different role at work, or just switch jobs entirely. All right. So now we're considering switching jobs in education. All right. So I'm writing down jobs slash education. Now, where do we get that from? Let's talk about using Udemy online. Let's
Hmm.
talk having conversations with the boss. Um, you know, development plans within work. right? Um, and then, for me, that's probably enough steps. Like that's probably where it starts,
Right.
right? And then within that, also, just maybe you just start applying for different things, right? So I'll write down applying. Um, Now with that, applying, like you might be thinking to yourself, well, how does that really serve me if I don't feel like I'm qualified for something? Well, in the process of applying, you find out what things you need, right?
Right.
You can read the job descriptions, or even if you were to start talking to people in the areas that you think you might want to get to, a part of that process is learning what the requirements are. So by learning the requirements through applying or just looking at applications and job descriptions, obviously that gets you to that point. But so we've made our list, right? We kind of worked it backwards, right? We learned that we need to start applying. We need to start having conversations with the boss, educating ourselves, looking for those jobs, those types of education. But the main thing is that we figured out, all right, we need to create an additional $25,000 per year in order to hit that 10-year mark of having $250,000, right? And now that's doesn't necessarily, like, that's outlandish, right? Because
Right.
most people aren't saving all of the money to buy a house cash, right? But that's just where my mind went, right?
Mhm.
Um, so you could break the numbers down further and just say, like, this is what we need to do in order to get our down payment,
Right.
right? So it's the same process, just smaller numbers. But this is what I mean by asking yourselves empowered questions and then building the process out to accomplish a goal.
No, that's a good example. I mean, it's definitely, yeah, intentionality, I know, and that's something we advocate for the entire our whole podcast is to just not flail around in your life, but be intentional so you can be better and win in your marriage. So yeah, I think that's perfect. And once you break things down into smaller, because each of those sections could be broken down even further. So like,
Mhm.
yeah, you would just write apply just like you did. And then now it's like, okay, create a resume if you don't have one, brush it up if you do, look at jobs, see what you have qualified for, what you need. So like there's each section takes another round of intentionality or two. And all those, when you're talking about this with another person, i.e. your spouse, like there's, double the ideas that can come in, double the solutions. And at that point, you're as a team just coming together. Um, that common goal thing with your spouse really just does something within your marriage. Like, and then when you
Yeah,
reach it, you're like, man, we just crushed it. Like, what else can we do? Like,
yeah.
like, let's go. Like, all those things. So yeah, just being intentional and working your way back really can shift in your marriage. And that can be in all things. Um, Trying to think of a less uh all right. I know we kind of workshop this silly, but something silly like going out to eat, right? So some people I've heard have issues with like this conversation starter of going out to eat, right?
Okay.
Um, as far as like one side giving all the like, let's go here, let's go here, let's go here, and the other person being like, nah, I don't want that. I don't want that. It starts out with the yeah, wherever you want. And then by the end, you could be frustrated with that. So taking a tip from our boy Damon, right? Um, if you just being intentional to ask empowered questions, right? Make a list of, your favorite places, her favorite places, and then make a list of um, different styles of food, because I can't think of the right word. Mexican, Italian, Asian, make your list of places that you've been and that you haven't been to. So then when it comes, this is what I'm thinking of how to get to empowered questions for me. It might take a little bit of, it's not going to come right off the top of my head all the time. So for those that think like me, have it in your little phone when it's time to say, hey, instead of saying, what do you want to eat? Or do you have a taste for anything? Right. I know that's a different question that I would ask. And she says yes or no. Okay. Then you can say, well, we have boom, boom, give a couple of favorite places. She could say no to that. I'm just saying she, because I'm using it from my perspective as a husband. She could say no. Then he said, well, we haven't had, Asian in a while. We have, Japanese steakhouse, a Chinese buffet, whatever. Throw that out there. If she does no to that, okay, well, we've been wanting to try such and such and such. By this time, there's at least like viable answers instead of just getting frustrated with which kind of food, which places you normally go, all that. So I think that's another way to get to the solution is, and this is a small solution, but we're just trying to go out to eat. But you're asking specific questions instead of just a vague, are you hungry? Where do you want to go? And that can take whoever's the asker, right? Especially if the person that you're asking is normally the one that cooks or whatever, and you just want to make it a nice experience. Maybe they had a long week or a rough day, and you're just, well, let's take that off their plate. We'll just go eat. We'll buy it. You don't have to figure it out. No cleanup. We go, we leave. So it's all in trying to have the best, your spouse in the best interest, and make it easy enough that they can answer questions or get their mind thinking a little bit outside the box and kind of focused in on what we're talking about. Because sometimes a broad, open-ended question won't allow thoughts to be focused. But with empowered questions, okay, you're like, all right, this is what we're doing. We're trying to get to the solution. We're walking it back or something of that nature. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I like it. And I think if it were me, we already admitted, right, that we were probably thinking differently about this, right? And if I'm getting to the goal is just going out to eat, right? For me, that's I'd want a more clear cut solution,
Mhm.
but if getting to a solution, then I'm okay with it, right? So for me, if that was the case, I'd probably try to walk it back and ask, like, what is the actual pain here, right? So even if you like take it to a sales approach, right? And I might even be thinking about my pain because I don't want to wait for an answer. I want to eat, and my true problem is that I've waited too long to have this discussion. Right? I'm hungry now, and I'm asking her what she wants to eat, and now I'm frustrated because she can't decide what she wants to eat.
Right.
Right. So number one, I in the future I need to eliminate the problem of asking too late. Right. But my pain is that I'm hungry now, and I need a solution yesterday. It's just like I wanted to be eating 30 minutes ago.
Right.
So now we get into your process of, all right, well, we've got, a list that we can consult, the agreed upon list. And I think that rather than bouncing it around so many times, for me, I'd present 2, 3 options tops. Right? Like option 1, 2, and 3. Decide on one of those. And if you don't want to, then I'm gonna pick one, and let's just roll on it. Because we've already decided previously that no matter which of these choices we choose, we understand that we both enjoy them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. For me, I just feel like it's it's a quicker path to getting to me stuff in my face.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that redirection, and no, that works fine. Um, yeah, anything else you want to say specifically on this topic?
Um, hmm.
Oh, we talked about we talked about kind of shifting the mind frame of, how we approach things. And one of the examples that you gave earlier before we started recording was like seeing somebody and saying like, oh, must be nice to be where you are.
Mm.
But the way that you could even that comment like doesn't help you in any way. So
Right.
if you're trying to improve or get to where they are, like if you see that and you acknowledge that what they have is something you want, you had a good set of questions that was like, don't say that, like, and I'm just going to shoot them out there because it really impacted me, my thought process. So instead of saying, oh man, it must be nice to be where you are, if you see someone doing something that you want to do, you were like, well, why don't you could ask, like, what are some of the struggles that you had to encounter to get where you are, right? Or like, I really see where you are, like, and I'm trying to get there, like, do you have any things that I should look to avoid in my journey there? Or like, what are some tips and tricks? Or, you know, can we have a chat and like we can talk about, how can I be better? Basically, it's like, what can I do better to achieve what you have, than more so just say must be nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can actually give you a specific um, example from this type of scenario. Back with my old job, I had a customer that owned a garage, right? And to look at him, you wouldn't know that he was a multimillionaire, right? He's just a guy, right?
Hmm.
Worked on cars, had one guy who worked for him, but I started seeing hints of it, right? He told me one day, "Hey, I'm moving the business soon from this spot to over to this spot." And I'm like, "Oh, just because I liked talking to him, I was curious, what's going on?" He's like, "Oh, I'm selling, or I'm leasing that building to Enterprise." And I'm like, "Oh, you own this place?" He's like, "Oh yeah, I've owned it for years." I'm like, "Okay." And I'm like, "So what's that like? What's the process?" Right? So now I'm asking empowered questions, like, not that it was something I was going to act on, but this is knowledge I can have for the future.
Hmm.
That's for that. And he's like, "Oh yeah." He's like, "Apparently Enterprise doesn't buy real estate." He's like, "I own a lot of real estate." I was like, "Really? Okay." So now I'm learning more about him, right? We're getting closer. But he tells me more about that process. And he says, "Yeah, they're going to come in, they're going to revamp the whole thing, make it look like one of their buildings. They pay for all of that." I was like, "Oh, wow." And I was like, "What happens after they move?" He was like, "They leave it, it's mine again." Right. It's his the whole time. But he was like, or no, I asked him, "Well, how long is the lease for?" He's like, 5 years. And I was like, is it actually longer than that? But they have a 5 year opt out. He's like, "Oh yeah, actually, it's technically 25 years, but they can opt out every 5 years up to that point." I was like, "Oh, that's crazy." He's like, "Yeah, it's a really good deal for me." Right. And then he started talking about how much other real estate he owns as far as like rentals. Right. And I said to him, I was like, "I would really love to have a conversation with you at lunch one of these days." And he was open to it. Right. So he picked the place, and it was probably a month later that we finally got around to it. But because I'm mildly interested in real estate, I wanted to have this conversation with him in order to just pick his brain, learn
Hmm.
more, see how he got started. You know, how much money did you get started with? Right? Because now that we're that far, or that deep into the conversation, those are things that are personal, but things that he's going to be more open to telling me because he sees that I'm trying to learn, right?
Hmm.
And that'll happen a lot of times. These people with this type of knowledge are willing to teach you, but you really have to show a uh, a desire for pulling that information out of them, and not just like a fly by night, you know, question or a fly by night statement saying, like we said before, "Oh, that must be nice." He's not going to say, "Oh, well, here's exactly what you have to do." Right? He's probably viewing that as a weak statement, right?
Right.
So if you dive deeper, ask those types of questions, empowered questions, you will get empowered responses that will teach you for the future. And that's just, one example of how I like to interact with people that have things that I would like to have, or have the style of life that I would like to have, or for my family, obviously. Um, But oh, by the way, I offered to pay for that lunch and he ended up paying. I just thought that was a cool note to throw in there because sometimes like you might not want to put yourself in that situation. Like I can't afford to take somebody to lunch,
Hmm.
right? I mean, at that time I could, but more or less, like he was like, "Nah, I'm willing to teach you. Like I'll pay for lunch. Don't worry about it." And like this dude is legit.
Yeah. I mean, just like we've been saying, when you find someone that you can talk to, most people want to teach. Like most
Mm,
people are not hoarders of their knowledge,
yeah,
um, or most of their knowledge anyway, if they have like a secret, whatever that is like their company sauce, but they'll give you enough to start and dive in and find out what your secret will be and what your product will be. So I think that is a great example. And we can wrap it up after that.
sounds good.